If you're a developer who works on front ends, you might know about design tools. Developers sometimes get to work with product designers or UI designers who use design tools like Sketch or Figma. These are basically vector drawing tools. They're very good at letting you quickly mock up UIs and explore lots of different ideas very quickly without investing the time into writing code. But then when it comes time to collaborate with engineering, that's where things can get complex. Engineers have to recreate the UIs essentially from scratch by hand using code. And inevitably, a lot of things can get missed in this translation or are just hard to translate because designs are freeform drawings. And so this leads to a lot of back and forth with design and ultimately these two sources of truth that, by most teams' admission are never truly in sync. Now, there are visual creation tools that let developers actually build production UIs. They're nothing new. They've actually been very widely used on other platforms like iOS and Android and Windows, but not really so much for the web. To make one that fits well with the web means fitting well with kind of how apps are written today, which means integrating in a natural way with code that's written using these compositional frameworks like React or Vue or Angular. And also UI builders are generally perceived as clunky and very technical, a very far cry from the ease and the speed of design tools. So anyway, on the web today, the status quo is to write everything in code. So there is a question of what a rethought development experience could look like for the web. There are also website builders. These are everywhere, and here's a tiny fraction of them. These can all be quite different from each other as well. So some are simpler and more for non-technical, small business owners, etc. And then there's others like Webflow, where you basically need to know CSS layout and all the nitty-gritty. But all these are focused on building mostly static websites that are optionally hooked up to some kind of content management system or something like that. But if you work on a web app where you have an actual team of developers and you have like databases and user accounts and custom business logic, or even if you work on a mostly static website like a Jamstack site, but you have more complexity going on in terms of like integrations, etc., then static sites builders really aren't meant for that. And so this brings us to the last category, which is UI builders for web apps. This is a much more nascent category, so these logos are probably recognized by far fewer people, but it's also emerging very fast, and this is actually just a small subset of the players. And these are all about bridging design and development. Yet they all have very different takes, so it's hard to summarize all of them together. For instance, modules lets you theme a design system of primitive components and start there. Hadron lets you craft web components. Visly lets you craft React components. It's been really exciting to see all this activity and raw tooling innovation happening. I work on Plasmic, so I can dive into that one. I want to spend more time talking about some of the challenges in building something like Plasmic. But in order to do that, I have to first show you what Plasmic is. And so I'll do that with a quick demo. And as I'm going through this, I would love to encourage you to think about, if you were to embark on building something like this, how would you go about it? So Plasmic is a browser-based tool. And for this demo, I'm going to show creating To-Do MVC, which is everyone's favorite reference app. I'm going to show just creating a rough subset of it, just to show how Plasmic works. Now, I'm creating everything directly in Plasmic here, but another way to get started is actually through importing from, for instance, Figma or another design tool. And that actually handles all the conversion of Figma stuff into web standards like CSS and divs. But for this demo, I'm just going to show creating everything directly in Plasmic. And the way I'm going to create things is I'm going to start with creating just a wireframe of what I want the rough app to look like. So I'm going to start with this title here, and right below the title, I'm going to add a box for the actual task. And in this box, I have another box inside of it for the checkbox, and I'm going to make this checkbox, let's say, rounded. And right next to that, I'm going to add some text for the actual task, like buy some milk, something like that. And I'm just, mocking up what this app should look like in various states. And so, I want a list of these tasks, really. And one thing I can do is I can just simply copy and paste this a bunch of times and do that. But then if I want to later, edit the look of these tasks, which I certainly will want to do, then I have to do that to all of them. And so they won't stay consistent, etc. And so a better way to go about it is to basically create a component out of this task. I'm going to call it my task component. And now I can instantiate this a bunch of times. So I have these 3 instances of the task component. So if I update any one of these instances by double clicking into it and making some changes, then I can see that they get reflected across all the instances. So that is pretty much it for the wireframe of this app. Very simple. Now I want to, from here, actually add the real styling, etc. So this is the workflow that Plasmic tries to enable, is to start from very rough designs, refine, and have something that you have ready for production. So I'm going to, first of all, start with the title here, which I'm going to, well, the font is probably pretty good, but I'm going to make it thin, and I'm going to make its color something like this light red color here. I'm going to save this color actually as my primary accent color, and things like color tokens, mix-ins, spacing tokens, etc. These are all things that are abstractions in Plasmic that help you maintain consistency and maintainability in your designs. So I'm also going to set the background of the page to be this off-white warm gray here, something like that. And the tasks I'm going to set to be this pure white background, like so. And I'm going to set the checkbox itself to be, let's say, transparent, but have a border color that is very light gray, something like that. The text right next to it, I'm going to make it, let's say, 20 point and or 20 pixels, and make it a little bit lighter, like that. I'm going to save that as my text color, like so. And the last thing I want to do is add some real layout to this thing, because these are just kind of haphazardly placed, but I'm going to actually lasso these into what's called a vertical stack, like so. And these stacks basically keep everything distributed in line always, and they're really just flexbox underneath. But layout is one of these things that is so prevalent in creating UIs that we want to streamline it as much as possible. So I'm going to show you that by, first of all, I'm going to clear out the background color from this thing, and I'm going to snap everything to the top, to the left. I'm going to double click an edge to auto size the content vertically and horizontally as well. These are some of the simpler features of very fast layout, but I'm going to show some more advanced features later on. I'm going to rename this element to be my task list element. Naming elements just helps keep them organized in your tree, and also will come in handy later for the actual code generation and code integration. So these tasks currently, they all say the same exact text, which is pretty boring. I want them to have different text. In fact, I want that to be variable. So I can double click into this component to edit it again, and I'm going to select this text and right click it to convert it into a slot. And slots are essentially, you can think of it as poking a hole in the component. So from outside of this component, from any one of these instances, I can actually select that slot and, for instance, customize it. I can change the text here to be make to-do app, show a demo, etc. But I can actually drop in arbitrary contents and any number of elements in them as well. So that is almost everything I wanted to do for my task component. The last thing I want to do is actually design it in its various states, which is, of course, very common for any component, is to make it represented in different states. So I could double click back into this component again to edit it, but instead what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click it to pop it out into its own new artboard on the side here. And you can think of these artboards as basically views into a component. You can create as many as you want. Just lets you focus on one thing at a time in isolation, which is, if you're familiar with React Storybook, it's a very similar concept. Now, the way that things like states and variations, etc., are modeled in Plasmic is through this unifying concept called variants. And the way that works is I'm just going to show creating a group of variants called states. And inside of states, I'll create a variant for, what I want my button to look like, or my task to look like when it's marked completed, or when it's being edited, or when it's marked high priority, etc. For this demo, I'm just going to design out the completed state. And when the task is completed, I want there to be a check mark in the checkbox. So I actually like the look of this check mark from the reference app. So I'm just going to screen grab this real quick, like so, and just paste it in to here. I'm actually going to zoom into a pixel level so I can adjust it like so. And, I can also use real layout. It doesn't really matter for this case. So that is my completed task, I can switch between my base appearance and my completed appearance so you can see the difference. And what's going on is this is actually not a copy of the base component, but just a set of deltas or overrides on top of the base appearance that are being recorded specifically for the completed appearance. So to show you that more clearly, I'm going to clone this artboard, this view of the component. So I have two views of this thing side by side. I'm going to set the bottom one to be looking at the base appearance of the component and the top one to be looking at the completed appearance. And if I make more changes to the base appearance, they do affect the completed appearance. They bleed through. So you can see it's not actually just a copy of the component or anything like that. It's just a set of deltas, like the presence of this checkbox. I can really customize anything else just directly through direct manipulation. So I can also set this thing to be strike through and set the color to be this light gray color, like so, whatever else I want for the completed appearance. And that is pretty much it, actually, for the this completed variant. Now, the thing about variants is that, and states generally, is that you can combine any set of them together. So to show that, let's say whenever I hover over any part of this task, I also want this, this circle to become darker. So I'm going to add a hover variant. And things like hover, press, etc. are very common interactions. So there's special affordance here for just quickly adding them. And for this hover state, basically wants the checkbox to become darker. So I'm just going to directly set the color to be darker. Now I can preview this whole thing and play with it. Okay, so that's close to what I want, but I realize actually another thing I want is for the hand pointer to appear when I'm hovering over it. So I'm going to set the cursor to be a pointer, and I'm going to try this again, like so. Okay, so that's better. So you can quickly, interact with these things and play with them, and just get this very fast feedback. Now, the thing about the variants is that they come with the component wherever it goes. So back in my main screen, I can select any one of these instances and set it to be in the completed state, for instance, just for the purpose of this mock. I can also preview this whole thing and play with it. And it's a little nuanced, but you can notice that as I'm hovering over this middle guy, we're dynamically combining the hover state and the completed state. And that, again, is just because we are just recording a set of deltas on top of the base appearance for these variants. Now, that is pretty much it for what I want to do for designing this app. Maybe the last thing I'll do is actually just tighten up the layout of this thing because everything's kind of still, free-floating. And so I'm going to set this whole thing to be a column layout that is centered. Maybe it has a bit of padding around it, like 64 pixels of padding, like so. I'm going to turn this whole thing into this whole screen into a component as well. So my to-do app component. So now I have these two components, my to-do app and my task component. And that is pretty much it for this app. Now for this next part, I'll show how to integrate it into the code from the code side of things. So one way to get started with this is through this code sandbox integration that Plasmic provides, which just lets you quickly spin up a sandbox. But for the purpose of this demo, more interesting to us is actually generating this into your own local code base. For that, there's this CLI that Plasmic provides, which I already have installed, so I'm going to skip that step. The first step you run to start using Plasmic in a code base is just this Plasmic init. And so I have this terminal open here where I'm going to paste in that command into this code base. And it asks you a bunch of questions that I'm just going to go with the defaults for. Now, this code base that I have is actually just a blank create React app. So this is what a blank create React app looks like. It's just a spinning logo. And the next step here is I'm going to run the Plasmic sync command, which actually pulls down the components that we created. I'm going to run that, and we should see that the to-do app and the task components are now in our code base here. I'm going to pull up my editor on the left and have my running app on the right. I'm going to replace all this boilerplate here. The first thing I'll do is just get things on the screen. So I'm going to replace all this with just rendering the to-do app component that we pulled down, like so. And I'm going to save and wait for the refresh to kick in. And there we go. This is exactly what we created in the tool, running pixel perfect in our own code base. Now, from here, of course, I want to wire this up to the real state and event handlers that I care about. So I'm going to click into this to-do app. This whole file has a lot of comments in it. So I'm going to get rid of all these comments so you can see it's actually a very simple one-line component here. So the to-do app is a thin wrapper around Plasmic to-do app. And so the way things work is Plasmic to-do app is this dumb presentational component. All it does is render things on the screen. And this is what is generated by Plasmic and regenerated also. And And then the to-do app is just, this whole file is actually owned by you. We just generate it as a convenience, starter skeleton, and you can do whatever you want with this file. So for instance, I could add my state here. And let's say that my state was just some simple React state that I want to show up on a screen. I want to show my own set of tasks. So I'm going to create my own set of tasks here. Let's say that I'm just going to use React state. And for these tasks, they just have a simple name component, name property. They're just objects with a name property. And I'll have 3 of them. And I'm going to wire them up to this component by referencing the task list element that we gave a name to earlier. So that task list, I'm going to replace all of its contents with my own set of tasks, like so. And I'm going to render these tasks using the other component that we synced down, the task component. And with that, we should see our own set of tasks show up in the app. Now you can continue in this fashion and just wire up whatever else you want, all the event handlers and other states, and you can drill into the tasks and do the same thing. Now, the thing about Plasmic is that it lets you go back into the tool and make further changes, which is important for any real-world product. It's something you iterate on. It's not just a one-time code generation. So to show that, I'm going to turn on watch mode here in my terminal. This will live stream any edits I make in the tool directly into the code base. I'm going to have my running app on the right. I'm actually going to place it to the far right because I don't have a ton of real estate on my screen. And I'm going to set my editor to be a little bit narrower like this. And let's say I wanted to make some violent changes to the layout of the whole thing. So I'm going to select this whole task list here, and I'm going to I'm going to first change the tasks themselves to be more boxy looking so that they're more amenable to being tiled. I'm going to double click this and just change it to be more boxy looking like so. And I'm also going to, while I'm here, add some real layout to it. So everything's row aligned and top aligned as well. I'm going to add some padding around the whole thing. I'm going to take this checkbox and pop it out of its place so that's free floating. And I'm going to move it down to the bottom right. And I'm going to pin it to the right and to the bottom. I'm going to make this tile a little bit bigger like so. Now, that's better. My tiles are here. Now, I want the task list itself to also be a row layout. So I'm going to switch everything to be from this vertical list to be a row layout. But now everything is spilling off the side of the screen. So I'm going to turn on wrapping and make this actually a fixed width kind of div. Now, it's a little hard for me to see the difference between these different tiles. So I'm also going to add a gap in between them. So in the vertical direction and in the horizontal direction as well. Things like, cross-platform, cross-browser gap is pretty annoying to do actually, but this is all stuff that Plasmic really tries to make as streamlined as possible. And you can see that as I was making those changes, they were streaming directly into the running app in my actual code base. So that is really the workflow that Plasmic tries to enable. So now that we have some idea of what Plasmic is and how it works, I'm going to peel back the curtain a little bit to talk about some of the challenges that went into building it. So the first is there's a set of technical challenges, including our state management. This is a sprawling client app with a ton of complex state that is constantly changing and a lot of surfaces that are reflecting various parts of that state. And there's certain interactions like drag operations, where if you want it to be smooth, meaning 60 frames per second, then you have a certain frame budget that you want to hit. And so you want to minimize the latency or the amount of work that you're doing per frame. And this is where a lot of state management frameworks focus on basically letting you update some state, and then they re-render the minimum set of components that they can get away with. But what makes this complex for us is a combination of latency and scale. So we had a project where you had 3 artboards on the screen, but if you had hundreds of artboards on the screen, then even the naive re-rendering of what you can get away with is probably still too much. And so an example of the thing we do instead is we break up our re-rendering updates into small incremental chunks so that we can lazily evaluate them. And I'm actually going to show you this in action in the canvas here. So as I am dragging around this checkbox here, you can pay attention to the position on the other artboards. You can notice that there is a bit of lag, and this is an artifact of basically we prioritize the artboard that you're dragging on, the thing that you're actually dragging as the highest priority, the things around you as lower priority and the things that are off screen as lower priority still. Basically, we spend a lot of time worrying about the state management infrastructure to make it easy for us to continue writing features without constantly worrying about this kind of low level, performance. Another example of technical challenges. So there's an important feature of Plasmic that I didn't get to show in the demo called code components. And this is the ability to bring in your existing React components, maybe from your own code base, maybe from a library like Material UI. And there's a lot of challenges here, such as, how do we make it easy for people to bundle up the components they care about without becoming experts in Webpack, for instance? And also, dynamic module loading. So like, how do you inject this foreign third-party code into your canvas in a secure and isolated way? But okay, let's say you solve these problems and now you have your Material UI button actually showing up in the canvas. How do you actually work with it? How do you configure its properties, etc.? And that's where Plasmic's language tooling comes in. And it basically crawls your code base to find the components available in it, reflects out the interfaces that they take, whether they're documented using TypeScript or prop types, and from there, essentially derive a set of controls that make the most sense. And this can be nuanced because, there are some props that you expect to show up as these controls in the right-hand panel. But then there's other props like children props or function as child props where you expect to manipulate it directly on the canvas through drag and drop. And so these are some of the layers of complexity in just accommodating existing code components in the tool. There's also a set of product challenges, such as distilling layout into a small set of intuitive controls. CSS layout is notorious for being hard to use, and layout is such a pervasive aspect of creating UIs that Plasmic really tries to focus on streamlining that as much as possible. CSS comes with a lot of concepts, both legacy and modern, and also different overlapping ways of achieving the same thing, but they all have different trade-offs and subtleties between them. And, for instance, to this day, I still spend time debugging which props affects the declared height of an element so that percentage heights can respect that. And this is especially annoying because the answer has actually changed in browsers over time. So anyway, Plasmic tries to unify and simplify a lot of these concepts into simpler controls that really cover the most common cases. And for those edge cases, you can always drop down into the lower level controls and fine tune things there. I alluded to this at the beginning, but you can also start by converting existing designs from something like Figma into basically web standards. What makes this hard is, a lot of these concepts, a lot of the tools, they come from graphic design backgrounds, like they have layers and layer masks and blend modes. And in CSS, for instance, you have inset and outset shadows, but you can have centered borders in Figma. So reconciling these mismatches is a bunch of complexity that today developers basically have to contend with in an ad hoc, one-off manner. And so Plasmic really tries to automate and handle a lot of that grunge work. But I think the most important challenge for Plasmic is really around code integration. So if you think about what is natural for visual direct manipulation and what's natural for expressing in code, we essentially want to marry the best of both worlds and find the most natural and flexible interface for doing so. This flexibility is both for practical reasons, such as, I just need to instrument the event handlers or data or whatever that I want on my screens. But there's also aesthetic reasons for wanting flexibility. So for instance, I want to control what my own component interfaces look like. I don't want Plasmic to dictate that, right? One simple example of this actually is in our code base that we showed earlier. I have this task component, and this task component, by default, I can just pass in this children prop. So that's the task name. And I can also pass in like some state variant. Like I want the states here to be, I want to show it in the completed state or editing state or high priority state, etc. But let's say I didn't want this interface. I actually want to pass in a higher level like task object into it. And then it internally will figure out what kind of children or content it should render, what state it should render in, etc. And so letting you retain that level of ownership and flexibility over your components is really important. So that was an important part of designing out what the API and code integration look like. So we've been using Plasmic to build out Plasmic itself. And in terms of the impact on our own workflow, the first thing I wanted to note is it instills a design first mentality. By thinking about the product and experience that you're going for up front, it forces you to think that through, and then all the code and logic that you fill in is in service of that end goal, which is really helpful for ensuring that you're building the right thing. And you can contrast this with the bottom-up approach, which bottom-up approaches definitely have their place, especially for projects that have high technical risk. But for a lot of projects, it can be a more bumbling approach as well. The second impact is if you are lucky enough to work with a designer who is technical enough to wield a tool like Plasmic, then there's something very magical about just running Plasmic Sync and having a nicer version of your landing page appear in your codebase. And I think this is important because developers today are closer to the code and are thus the gatekeepers of what actually goes into the product. So if we want to broaden the audience of folks who can contribute to the product, then the burden is on us to welcome designers and the other folks into the fold of directly iterating. The last impact on our workflow is if you are familiar with tools for visual regression tests or manual QA of your designs and code. For instance, there's these popular storybook plugins that help show your Figma designs next to your code components. All that is obviated when you have a method for declaratively specifying exactly what you want the end result to look like, because what you see in Plasmic is exactly what you get in the production environment. So that kind of sidesteps a whole class of QA tooling for us. That's all I wanted to share about Plasmic. It's still very early days for us, but also for a lot of the tools in this camp. I'm very excited about this entire category generally. There's just a lot of innovation happening that I think could really transform what front-end development looks like in a few years. So I definitely encourage you to check out these tools. We'll also be sharing our own progress on Twitter. And the last thing I'll call out is that we are hiring. We're a tiny team of 5 people total, 3 on engineering. So if these challenges sound like fun, definitely let us know. Thank you.
Thank you, Zhang, for such an awesome talk. And also such a cool looking tool. It seems like a lot of people in the chat are interested in it. And also, I very much enjoyed your Care Bears slide there because I'm a big fan of Care Bears and have my Care Bear shoes behind me.
You need to grab one of those and let us see it up close because that looks cool, but I haven't seen it. Those are cool. Nice.
So we were just chatting earlier and you were saying it, the tool is super cool, but it's not complete yet. So what is the next feature that you're working on?
Yeah, there's so many different things that are missing and we want to get to. A big thing that we're trying to think about right now is how to prioritize all the different directions that we can take this thing in. One big one that comes up quite a bit is around code components and making sure we support bringing in your existing component libraries and whatnot out of the box. That's one we hear a lot. And then there's things around more layout and more capabilities in the tool. So right now, I talked about Flexbox.
I was gonna say if you can perfect Flexbox for me, then you've got to convert.
Flexbox is already perfect. What are you talking about?
No. It's perfect except when you try and use other people's stuff and make it work in a component library. Yeah. Anyway, go ahead. Sorry.
No, yeah. The tool right now is entirely focused on Flexbox-based layouts, but there's, I think the big other modern layout paradigm is grid, and so thinking about how to better support grid, or actually even within Flexbox, there's a lot more depth that you can take it in. Right now you kind of configure Flexbox through these controls on the right bar, but there's also very natural affordances just in the canvas itself, or when you drag and resize something and it snaps to be the full width of its parent container or whatever, you can do the intelligent thing of actually making that lock in a certain Flexbox setting or whatnot. So these are all things that we're exploring as well, and including more on canvas layout controls for adjusting margin and padding and whatnot.
Yeah.
These are all.
Joe's talk went into quite a bit about real-time stuff, and real-time stuff is always a challenge for these kinds of tools. So what's your approach to solving like the real-time like collaboration around your product, or have you avoided that to date, or like what's your...
We have avoided that to date.
Yeah.
Big hairy problem.
Yep.
But it is something that we have on the roadmap. But I think actually a step before that, we kind of wanted to explore a different mode of collaboration, which is less about real time and more about branching and versioning based flow. So that you can kind of take risks with the changes that you make and not worry about perturbing having downstream effects, because at the end of the day, this is a tool for crafting things that go into production. So you just want to have a little more control about how you release things into production, or how you release things to other people to build on top of, and maybe have the ability to like review what has changed in this particular set of changes. And I think for that, there's a whole class of interesting tools that we can create around like visual diffing of this is what I had before, this is what I end up now, and also this component is used in all these other places, and so what are the downstream effects of that? So
Yep.
So you've mentioned diffing and you've mentioned branching and things like that. Those are, in my mind, developer terminologies. Is it fair to say that this is a tool aimed at developers creating user interfaces rather than designers trying to create code? Is that right?
Yeah, that's our main focus right now, is making this a developer tool that is expressive enough to handle all the complexity of production and reality. We are trying really hard to keep the tool as approachable and welcoming as possible to as broad an audience as possible. But the thing that takes priority is being able to accomplish the things that you need to accomplish. So that's why I was mentioning, if you have somewhat technical designers or folks who are otherwise able to wield something like Plasmic, then that's great. Definitely welcome them into the tool. But we also have our work cut out for us in terms of like making the tool, something that is simpler and less complex, even for developers. It benefits everyone. So
yeah,
seems like you've hit the nail on the head, really. And speaking as a developer who's got no creativity when it comes to design, this seems like the perfect thing for me, to be honest. I'm over the moon you've given this tool.
Very cool. So how have you dealt with this crazy year? Like for me, it's been great because I'm working on a startup. So I've been, okay, it's not been great, but like if there was a year where this had to happen, I'm glad it was this year rather than say last year or next year. What about you? Like how's it impacted your ability to live and get things done and cope?
Yeah, I think we were really fortunate in that we were already a remote and distributed team kind of before COVID and everything. The company just started, not too long before COVID, and so our day to day has been not like too violently shaken up. We've just basically been pretty heads down on building this thing. So fortunately, not. I think in a similar camp, not too much has changed for us, but it is really interesting that just seeing the rest of the world actually kind of move toward remote work first, and and companies just changing their policies to embrace remote work as like the default. That's not even as a temporary COVID specific thing, but just
like Microsoft said
forward.
You can work from home forever if you want to, as long as you're productive, and it's like great. Yeah, that's cool.
Yeah.
I'm surprised it took this long, to be fair, but also I know a lot of companies really resisted it because they just didn't feel like it worked for them. But hopefully it'll allow people to have more flexibility to work from where they want to be rather than having to move to a city to be at that company and things like that. I think that's a good win. Yeah.
And it's got to save companies money on rent. Rent in London is expensive, I'm sure. Rent in San Francisco must be astronomical for office buildings.
Yep.
That's true.
It is. Cool. Well, I think we're pretty much out of time. I mean, I always started a minute or two late, but I think it's a good natural conclusion of our chat. So thanks for making the time for us and participating and sharing your wonderful work with us and making it general enough that we can all relate and yet like tell us sort of the story of what you're building and why you're building it. It's always cool to see startups doing things that help us make better products. So thank you.
Awesome.
And
no, thank you guys for having me.
Of course. Take care. Thanks. Bye.
Take care.
Bye.